Grace and peace, everyone. My name is Ryan, and I'm the movie pastor. I love to use my movie pass to watch movies and think theologically about them. This is my second video on Terminator Dark Fate, and I just wanted to share a little bit more, but I felt like I was getting long-winded in the first video, and there's a whole second conversation to be had. That's the popular conversation that I see in other review sites and so on. People are talking about the nature of canon. Wow, what a big conversation, what an important conversation to be having as Christians. It's one of the most common questions that skeptics ask Christians is, well, the Bible, didn't King James choose what would be in the Bible and what wouldn't? How can we really trust what the Catholic Church cut out? And that used to be a really hard question to answer because there were no relevant analogs. There was nothing we could really talk about that worked the same way that the Bible did. But now we can, because all of these fiction franchises are starting to say yes to this, yes to that, no to this one, no to that one, and yes to this one. That's what Terminator did. And Terminator Dark Fate recognizes the canonicity, the legitimacy of the Terminator, recognizes the legitimacy of Terminator 2, ignores the legitimacy of everything else, treats it as apocrypha, says, I don't really care about any of that, and then goes on and tells a follow-up to Terminator 2 with Terminator Dark Fate. It's an interesting move. Like, are you even allowed to do that? Well, Cameron did, and it seems that his reason for it is to say that the others were not, my language now, apostolic. He was involved in the first one, he's involved in the second, and then he was not involved again until this one, at least not as a, he was credited as like characters by kind of things. But now he's really using his vision, and he's telling a third story and saying those other stories, they're not my stories, and so they're not legitimate. That's the standard we used for the New Testament. Was it written by one of the apostles or not? But there's a similar standard thing going on that also all of those other movies between Terminator 2 and Terminator Dark Fate weren't very good. And so there's this goodness by apostolicity question. Do we recognize, what do we do when a movie comes out and it's just not very good? And often many of these franchises are saying, well, we reboot it. We just ignore that ever happened and we go on to the thing that actually is good. So again, with Terminator Dark Fate, we're in the midst of this discussion of what is goodness, what is quality, what makes a thing good, and what do we do when a thing is good. There's another question I want to throw onto the table of this canon. How do we respond to what is and what isn't canon, and how does canon work? And that's, can we be progressive backwards? I mean, say what you will about the film, like it or hate it, it made definite effort to diversify the cast and to say a progressive message. You suddenly had what had been an all-white straight movie in The Terminator. You had for a while, all-female cast, that all the protagonists were women, and in a story taking place south of the border with a lot of non-white characters in it. You had a non-white Terminator, you have a non-white main character in Danny Ramos. And so are you allowed to do that? What's the rules? Can you go and take a movie that had a particular message to it and retroactively, by adding something new to the canon, affect what was said by that first movie about who's important and whose stories matter and what color Jesus is? I think that's an interesting question, and it's a question that's very live in our society. Famously, J.K. Rowling has been tweeting and giving commentary about her own books and trying to retroactively make them more progressive, saying things like, oh yeah, Dumbledore was gay the whole time, and the fans have been very anti that. And so are they going to have the same reaction to Terminator Dark Fate, saying, I'm now going to tell a new story in this canon, and it's going to have a different edge. It's going to have an edge that has to do with immigration. And what about the Bible? the Bible had an Old Testament that many people have some strong feelings about about the way women are treated in the Old Testament, and the way laws work and the way punishment is decreed in the Old Testament. Is the New Testament allowed to come along, Johnny come lately, and say a different thing about love and mercy and justice? And can that retroactively go back and redeem the Old Testament and forgive it of the things it's done wrong? Well, that's an important discussion to have, and I want to hear your opinion about it. I hesitate to even say anything else, but I will, because that's what I'm doing with this channel. For me, I think the whole Terminator series, it started out, The Terminator was really a horror movie. It was a sci-fi horror. It wasn't an action flick until T2. And what a good sci-fi horror does is it plays with fears that we already have. And so in The Terminator, we were dealing with this fear of the future rise of technology, the rise of the machines. Is technology going to overtake us and replace us? And so we're still dealing with that discussion in Terminator Dark Fate, but that discussion has become a discussion of the least of these. We've started to realize that the people who are most threatened by automation, and Terminator Dark Fate made it explicit that we're talking about automation, are the factory workers in the 2/3 world. And so I think because we're dealing with that story already, it's very faithful to take that story and put it in a new place. I also think that James Cameron did something that J.K. Rowling didn't, that is a lot more legitimate, is that if James Cameron had tweeted and said, "Oh, what? White people? No, Sarah Connor was black this whole time. That was just a strange casting decision," I don't think that would have flown. But for Cameron to say, "Oh yeah, those things stand, but we're going to add new things that are going to round out the story, and they're going to tell their own story without changing the past too much, but with more of this edge," that's a more legitimate way to come alongside an existing canon and to round out the whole thing. To me, that's more comparable to what the New Testament did to the Old, than going back and revising or changing what was said. But what I think is not the only thing that matters. I want to hear what you think, so sound off in the comments.
And when in scenes of glory I sing the new song, 'twill be